They said you were too much, but what they meant was you felt too deeply, you saw too clearly, you refused to dilute yourself for people who only know how to sip. From the beginning, they didn't want your truth. They wanted your silence dressed as politeness, your passion edited down to what they could control. They called you overwhelming because you showed up with your whole soul, and they were used to people who only brought their mask. You're too emotional, they said, when your anger made them feel seen. Too intense when your joy scared them into confronting their own numbness. Too dramatic when your boundaries made them uncomfortable. But the truth is, they never wanted all of you. They only loved the pieces they could use and shamed the parts they couldn't. You weren't too much. You were just finally enough to reveal how little they actually were, and instead of growing, they chose to shrink you. Not directly, but slowly, with eye rolls, with dismissive smiles, with that look that says, "Calm down," even when you're just telling the truth. And you began to believe them. That your depth was dysfunction, that your standards were selfish, that your voice was violence, until one day, silence felt safer than sincerity, and that's when they won. Too much is not a description, it's a tactic, a soft-spoken execution. They didn't attack you, they bled you slowly, with suggestions, with gentle condescension, with concerned advice that taught you to second-guess your instincts. And you did. You shrank yourself just enough to stay liked. You made yourself quiet enough to keep the peace. You filtered your feelings, smoothed your edges, walked on eggshells like it was a skill set. And the worst part? You thought that was maturity, that keeping the room comfortable was your job, that your ability to make others feel okay was proof you were finally healed. But healing isn't hiding, and boundaries aren't betrayal. Every time you swallowed your truth, you fed their illusion. Every time you stayed silent to avoid conflict, you confirmed their belief that they were right, that you were unstable, that you needed fixing. But the only thing broken was the story you were told, that strength means smallness, that love means less of you. No, that's how they trained you to disappear, quietly, so they could stay loud. Loud in their control, loud in their expectations, loud in how little they ever tried to understand you. Nietzsche said that people fear what reveals their weakness. That chaos isn't dangerous. What's dangerous is what reflects the chaos they're trying to hide. You weren't too loud. You were too revealing. You didn't bring drama, you brought light. And when that light hit their mask, they ran, because now the game was over. Their version of reality shattered, their stories questioned, their power suddenly fragile. You didn't destroy them, you just refused to lie for them. And that's what made you too much. You were the mirror they never asked for, the silence they couldn't manipulate, the presence that made avoidance impossible. You think you were rejected for being emotional, but what you were was unmanageable. They couldn't predict you, they couldn't guilt you into submission, they couldn't use you to stay blind, and that's what made you dangerous. That's what made you too much. Because in a world obsessed with comfort, truth becomes a threat, and those who carry it are always called the problem, until they stop asking for permission. You thought you were the storm, but you were the mirror, and they broke it, because they didn't like what it showed. Your anger wasn't the problem, it was their guilt being seen. Your sadness wasn't heavy, it just reminded them of everything they never processed. You weren't difficult, you were clear. And clarity is terrifying for people who survive through confusion. So they turned it on you, blamed your volume for their silence, blamed your honesty for their avoidance. And the cruelest part? They made you feel like they were doing you a favor. "I'm just trying to help. You should work on that. You're too emotional to see it." But you saw it. You saw everything. You just kept quiet because you wanted to be loved more than you wanted to be right. And they knew it. They could feel the moment your boundaries cracked under the weight of your hope. That's when the manipulation began. Not as cruelty, but as comfort. They convinced you that self-erasure was peace, that smallness was maturity, that restraint was wisdom, but it wasn't growth, it was training. They were teaching you how to disappear gently. And the more you disappeared, the more they loved you. Not the real you, but the edited version. The one who smiled when hurting. The one who said, "It's fine," while bleeding. The one who stopped bringing things up just to keep things calm. You became easier to love the less you existed. But only because love, in their world, was never about depth. It was about manageability, containment, silence. And you gave it to them, slowly, painfully, because deep down you believed that maybe, if you became small enough, they would finally feel safe enough to hold you. But they didn't want to hold you. They wanted to control the version of you they could tolerate. And the worst part is, you let them. Not because you were weak, but because you were loyal, because you hoped, because you thought love meant compromise. But it doesn't. Not when compromise costs you your voice. Not when it turns your truth into tension. Not when your ability to feel becomes a threat. You weren't loved. You were managed. And even then, barely. But here's the shift they never saw coming. Your silence was never permanent. It was preparation. You were never too much. You were just too early for people still hiding from themselves. And now? You're done shrinking. You're done making excuses for the weight of your presence. You're done apologizing for the volume of your truth. Because maybe the real question was never, why am I too much? Maybe the question was, why were they always so little? And maybe, just maybe, they always knew that if you ever stopped begging to be understood, they'd have to finally understand themselves. That's why they feared your fire, not because it burned them, but because it illuminated everything they refused to see. And now that you're no longer flinching when they say too much, now that you sit calmly in your fullness without flinching, something shifts. They get quiet, not because you shouted, but because they ran out of ways to explain your stillness. And in that stillness, they finally hear what they tried to silence. You. The moment you stopped explaining, everything changed. Not for you, but for them. Because silence, real silence, isn't absence. It's presence without apology. You no longer tried to be softer so they could feel stronger. You no longer diluted truth just to keep their comfort intact. And when you stopped explaining your emotions, they had to confront their impact, not because you said anything, but because you didn't. That's when the air shifted. The conversations got shorter. The room got colder, not because you were angry, but because you weren't available. They felt the absence of access, not the absence of love. You were still there, still present, just no longer participating in your own manipulation. And that's what they never prepared for. You didn't slam the door, you just stopped opening it. And silence, in the hands of someone who used to beg to be heard, is terrifying. Not to you, to them, because now they're alone with the noise they used to drown you out. They don't know how to love someone they can't manage. That's why they called your truth aggression, your boundary cruelty, your silence punishment. They needed you to stay confused so they could stay in control. And when confusion stopped working, so did the connection. That's not love breaking. That's control losing its grip. And they'll tell you you've changed, that you've become cold, distant, detached. But you're not detached, you're unhooked. You're no longer answering to emotional bait, no longer rising to provocation disguised as care. You don't argue now because the truth doesn't argue. You don't defend now because your clarity isn't on trial. You've stopped trying to be understood by people committed to misunderstanding you, and in that stillness, something powerful grows. Not resentment, not revenge, but distance. A distance so precise, it cannot be crossed by guilt. A space so clean, it refuses to echo with shame. You no longer fight. You just don't return. And now they stare at your silence like it owes them something, like your withdrawal is the offense, and their erasure wasn't. They forget you begged to be heard, that you once explained your pain like it was your fault, that you folded, edited, performed just to be tolerated. They forget the years of translation you did just to be seen, because now all they can see is you, unedited, unbent, and completely still. They call it passive-aggressive, but this isn't aggression, it's clarity. It's the absence of confusion they once depended on to stay above you, and now, without your explanations, their behavior echoes, their words linger, their control loops back to them, unanswered. And that's what power really is. Not volume, not force, but being untouchable in the places they used to wound you. That's what silence becomes when it's earned. Surgical, precise, and irreversible. They used to call your feelings too much. Now they call your silence concerning. Nothing changed except access. You still feel, you still notice. You just no longer explain it in a language that flatters their comfort. That's what boundaries are. Not walls, but translations that no longer get sent. You've learned that access is currency, and you've spent too much of it on people who only came to steal clarity and leave confusion. They called it emotional intimacy. But really, it was just open borders for psychological theft, and you're done funding invasions. Because love without protection is exploitation, and vulnerability without reciprocity is ritual self-harm. So now you say less, reveal less, offer less, not from fear, from wisdom. You've realized that the most dangerous thing about you was never your anger, it was your access. And now that it's gone, they call it a problem, but it's not a problem. It's a policy. And it's not up for discussion. You used to think love meant being open, available, understanding, but now you know. Love that requires self-erasure is not love. It's a slow death with good lighting. They didn't love your wholeness. They loved your willingness to break yourself into digestible pieces. They loved your patience when it served them, your softness when it silenced your truth, your empathy when it allowed their cruelty to go unchecked. But that version of you is gone, and not in flames, not in rage, but in distance. The kind of distance that says, I've measured what I gave and what it cost, and I'm done paying. You're not colder now. You're just not available for false warmth. You don't need to yell to be heard. You don't need to leave in anger to leave completely. You just let the door close, softly. And this time, it stays closed, not because you're bitter, but because you finally understand what it means to love yourself louder than you ever begged to be loved by them. They won't say it, but they feel it. Your peace is a threat, not because you weaponized it, but because it can't be disturbed. Not by guilt, not by bait, not by apologies that come only when silence becomes inconvenient. They say you changed, and they're right. You stopped bleeding for people who wouldn't offer you a bandage. You stopped shrinking in rooms that dimmed just to feel taller. You stopped fighting for closeness that only gave you exposure, never safety. And now? Now your silence doesn't just hold absence, it holds consequence. They don't fear losing you. They fear being seen by you. And when you no longer explain your absence, they're left alone with their reflection. That's where the discomfort lives. Not in what you said, but in what you're no longer willing to say. You didn't become hard, you just became whole. And whole things don't bend to fit inside broken places. Now they speak carefully around you, not out of respect, out of uncertainty. They don't know who you are without the need to be loved. They don't know how to control someone who no longer reacts. And so they call you distant, mysterious, cold. But what they really mean is, you stopped being readable to people who only read you to find weaknesses. You stopped offering footnotes to your emotions, stopped translating your silence for their comfort. And in that quiet, they get loud, they provoke, they poke, they bait, because chaos was always how they measured control. And now that you've taken that away, they panic, not because you're angry, but because you're unreadable. That's what silence does. It becomes a mirror they can't edit, a reflection they can't dodge. They look at you and see themselves, not how they see you. And that, more than any argument, any breakdown, any outburst, is what scares them most. You used to believe you had to prove you were good, that you had to show your softness, your empathy, your capacity to forgive, to be worthy. But now you understand. Those who demand your softness often do so to avoid accountability. They weaponize your grace to escape their guilt, and you've stopped handing them the excuse. You no longer defend your boundaries, you enforce them, without lecture, without performance, without needing to be seen as kind. Because kindness without self-respect is submission, and silence without conviction is self-erasure. But that's not what you carry now. What you carry now is clarity, stillness, presence. And that presence disrupts people used to you disappearing first. You used to ask, what did I do wrong? Now you ask, why did I let them convince me disappearing was love? That question doesn't come with closure, it comes with ownership. And ownership is what ends the cycle. Nietzsche said, the higher we soar, the smaller we appear to those who cannot fly. And maybe that's what all of this was. Not rejection, but altitude. Not loss, but clarity. Not too much, just too real. You were never the problem. You were the proof that something deeper existed, and that terrified them. You didn't ruin the relationship, you ruined the illusion. And illusions don't die quietly, they scream on their way out, but you no longer answer screams, you listen to silence now, because that's where your truth lives. In the stillness, in the absence, in the space you used to fill with explanations, hoping someone would meet you there. They never did. And now, you don't wait. You don't return, you don't shrink to be chosen, you rise and let whoever can't breathe at that altitude call you too much from the ground. One day someone will meet you and not ask you to become smaller. They won't flinch at your depth. They won't label your emotions as unstable. They won't confuse your honesty with hostility. And you won't have to translate your soul just to be heard. There will be no performance, no shrinking, no editing, just space, clean, steady, and wide enough to hold all of you. And in that space, you will realize that you were never too much. You were just misplaced, planted in shallow soil, expected to bloom quietly. And now you know better. Now you know what fits, what doesn't, and what deserves no second explanation. You will stop apologizing for your intensity. Stop asking if your standards are too high. Stop checking if your truth is digestible. Because now, you've tasted peace. And once you taste peace, chaos loses its flavor. Nietzsche never said it, but maybe he should have. The problem was never your fire. The problem was that they were soaked in gasoline and didn't want to burn. You were the spark that made their denial combustible. And instead of healing, they blamed you for the explosion. That's what too much really means. It means you saw too far, felt too deep, loved too loud, and they weren't ready to be seen in that clarity. So they hid behind criticism, behind distance, behind silence that punished instead of protected. But silence is different now. It no longer hurts you, it holds you. You've stopped begging for someone to meet you where you already were. You've stopped performing for an audience that never clapped. And now, you don't resent them, you just don't return to them. Because some people don't deserve closure, they deserve distance and silence that echoes back everything they tried to bury. So let them say you were too much, let them whisper it like a warning. Let them label what they couldn't control and walk away thinking they won. You're not here to correct them. You're not here to convince anyone that your existence is just the right size, because the ones who get it won't flinch. They'll listen without fear, they'll stay without taming, and the rest? Let them misunderstand. Let them tell the story wrong. Let them remember your silence and fill it with whatever they need to believe. Because you no longer owe anyone the softened version of who you are. You don't exist to be palatable, you exist to be whole. And if that's too much, then may they choke on their comfort while you breathe freely at last.